One of the most involved and fantastic stories in Genesis is the story of Joseph. You may have guessed it simply from the fact that Joseph is the only patriarch, the only story out of Genesis that gets his own Broadway musical. So maybe you remember the family tree from Genesis. If not, it goes something like this. Abraham and Sarah, whom we heard about last week, and the call of God upon them to be a blessing to others and the world. They had an interesting journey with God, but they also had in their late age a son named Isaac. And then Isaac married Rebekah, and they carry on the covenant of God and have sons named Jacob and Esau. Jacob marries Rachel and has a son named Joseph. But, and this is really where our story begins, Jacob also has another wife, Leah, and two handmaids by which he has additional children, brothers to Joseph, or half-brothers to Joseph. And this is where we get to our scripture for today from Genesis 37. So what is it that God's people are called to be? A blessing, like we heard last week. However, clearly, as with the other stories we find in Genesis, we keep as a people struggling with that. Now, even though Joseph is the inheritor of the covenant, the promise and blessing of God that was gifted to Abraham, passed down to Isaac, and then to Jacob, this Joseph story in chapter 37 is not really at first at all a story of blessing, but a story of tension. And there are several reasons for that tension. First, it says that Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his children. Joseph was Jacob's son by his beloved wife Rachel. The sons of Jacob's other wives, Bilhah and Zilpah and Leah, must have daily felt the sting of that favoritism, displayed most notably in the gift of the coat of many colors, or as our translation reads, a coat with sleeves. This was an expensive gift, and one that would have noted its wearer as above the menial field labor that was daily a part of his brothers' lives. What I think is interesting to note here is that Jacob should have known better. If you push back not far at all into Jacob's own story, you quickly run into favoritism that pits one son against another. In his case, it was Jacob versus Esau. It tears that family apart and causes distress and strife in Jacob's own life. He's been here before. He has lived this out. In fact, it is a pattern that has been repeated time and again within this family system, all the way back through the rivalry of Ishmael and Hagar versus Isaac and Sarah. These patterns of favoritism and inequality, growing into jealousy and division and anger, and then erupting into violence and fracture, have been played out again and again and again already in Genesis. And I might suggest are still being played out today in 1,000 ways, systemically in our larger human family. Second, Joseph seems to like to stir up this tension, doesn't he? He tells tales about his brothers to their father. His coat sets him apart and increases jealousy among those brothers. And his dreams, not just any dreams, his brothers' sheaves will bow down to his. The sun and the moon and the stars will bow down to him. But maybe worse than just having those kinds of dreams, he tells his brothers about them. Surely Joseph, so smart in other ways throughout the story, realizes the impact of continually telling his brothers that one day they will bow down to him. So this is Joseph. His father loves him. His brothers hate him. We are told this repeatedly with cumulative force. They hated him and could not even speak to him. And then violence follows. Here we see the complexity of the human condition. Why is it that our call is so clear to be a blessing to others, but the reality, the way that we struggle with life and life together leaves us too often alienated and even antagonistic toward one another? Antagonism and alienation are what happens to Joseph and his brothers. Things had gotten so stirred up among them that They saw him at a distance, the text says, coming toward them. And before he reaches them, they plotted to kill him. As one commentator suggests, they were able to contemplate fratricide because they saw him at a distance. They refused to allow him to come close before they made their decision. He was a threat rather than a person. He was their enemy rather than their brother. They could see his cloak and its many colors, but they could not see his face. How much easier is that to do harm to another, whether that harm be physical or verbal or emotional or systemic, when we keep ourselves at a distance from one another, when we throw up barriers to knowing one another face to face. We are still called to be a blessing, but yet we allow these alienations to grow and animosity to prosper and divisions to emerge and oppression to linger. But God is never finished, and God prevails. This very evil act by Joseph's brothers of plotting to kill him and them deciding to throw him in the pit and then sell him into slavery begins this thrilling sequence of events that reverses everything and runs through to the very end of the book of Genesis. Joseph is sold and taken into slavery by the traveling Midianite traders. He has some interesting experiences in Egypt that find him, dreamer that he was, interpreting dreams for the Pharaoh. This earns him a most favorable position in Egypt, which leads to an encounter again with his brothers. While Joseph has been finding new life in Egypt, his brothers were facing challenges and even famine in the land of Canaan. They are so famished that they come to Egypt for relief. And who do they encounter but Joseph? In an ironic twist of events, their salvation was now at the hands of the brother they had sought to destroy so many years before. Making his identity known to them, Joseph says, "Come closer to me. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here," Joseph says, "for God sent me before you to preserve life." Not until this moment in the story, when Joseph is reunited with his family and must come to terms with his past, does he realize the sense of it all. Recognizing that things turned out as they did, not because he or anyone else intended them, certainly not his brothers, nor the chief steward, nor the all-powerful Pharaoh. He gives credit instead to God. For only God could turn the accidental events of his life into something meaningful and salvific for so many. This is the profound statement of biblical faith, that God's way is working its way in us and through us and around us, that God's way is working sometimes with our decisions and sometimes against the decisions we make, but always for God's grace and blessing to be experienced by all. The brothers act in jealousy and revenge, and Joseph is sold into slavery, but God turns their jealous deed to good purpose. Joseph is falsely thrown into prison for his interaction with Potiphar's wife, but God uses Joseph's imprisonment as a springboard for Joseph into the household of the Pharaoh, a springboard for God's good purposes. A devastating famine brings suffering and hungering across the Mediterranean basin, but out of it comes this opportunity for the reunion of the children of Jacob and the promise for life for all of them through the witness of the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The actors in this drama never knew that something more profound and deep under and around and through their decisions is working its way out. They were going about their lives, making their choices, sometimes out of reasonableness and sometimes out of jealousy and spite, and sometimes out of desperation. Yet all along, in and through and around their decisions, again, sometimes working with them and sometimes working against them, God was working God's way out. Joseph recognizes this with his closing statements that we read from chapter 50. He says, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm for me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as God is doing here today." And because Joseph was able to do that, he is able to extend true forgiveness to his brothers, saying, "So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." The brothers have approached Joseph. Again, after that initial encounter, they can't seem to believe that Joseph has forgiven them. They worry that he has only held his anger in check out of respect for their father, Jacob. And now that Jacob has died, that they are certain that Joseph is going to take vengeance upon them. But because of the peace that Joseph has found in his trust in God's purposes working their way out in his life, the redemption of those actions, he is able to fully and deeply offer his own forgiveness to them. He sees them not from a distance, but to face. He shares with them tears of love and joy and relief. It is important to realize that in the end, strong and enduring human relationships are built on this ability to forgive one another. Strong and enduring human relationships are founded on the ability to hear the other and have the other hear you. To share with another and have another share with you. To be vulnerable to the other, even as the other is vulnerable to you. To listen to what the other believes and to have the other listen to what you believe, as together you forge a common pathway forward. And because those actions are so hard to accomplish fully, we know how hard they are, don't we? And inevitably we stumble in that work. The foundation must be the willingness to forgive. Joseph arrives at that place of forgiveness by acknowledging that God has been working in his life, even when he cannot see it. God is working to bring good about in our lives. And that trust frees us to be at peace with ourselves and with God, and then by extension to offer that peace to others. In these times of strained political dialogue, of blind ideological zeal, of societal grievances and cultural challenges where we seem to be constantly pitting against each other, male against female, black against white, conservative against liberal, Democrat against Republican, perhaps we can learn from the wisdom of Joseph, gained from a lifetime of struggle. Trust God is working for the good in our time and across the pages of human history, past, present, and future. Be at peace because you are a child of this good and gracious God, and you cannot, no matter how hard you try, have all of the answers all of the time. And then practice forgiveness and mercy toward your opponent or your enemy. Instead of seeking this sort of dead-end retaliation and revenge, because forgiveness and mercy towards those who have wronged you is the only path forward into the goodness God intends for all God's children. Perhaps then we can not only survive the next few months as a country, but make possible something new altogether. Amen.